Well, your rights and freedoms matter in this country, and we're going to talk about your rights and freedoms and why they're not only important, but also the state of your rights and freedoms. And it looks like a pretty bad picture. So, with me here today to talk about the state of rights and freedoms in this country is Josh Dehaas, and he's a lawyer and counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation. And he's also the co host of the podcast Not Reserving Judgment. So, a warm welcome, Josh.
Thanks, David. Happy to be here.
Well, it's great to see you, Josh. I am very much looking forward to our discussion, or maybe I should retread that a little bit. I'm kind of mixed about it because, quite frankly, we're going to dare to do the impossible here by summarizing and touching on kind of the state of affairs in this country about individual rights and freedoms. So I wanted to just set the table a little bit for our conversation, Josh. And I know that you're a lawyer, you're counsel for the Canada Constitution Foundation. I wanted to start off with a really basic question. What is the foundation's work?
So the Canadian Constitution Foundation is a nonprofit, and what we do is we try to educate Canadians about their rights and freedoms so that they can better defend themselves against governments trying to take those rights and freedoms away. We also do strategic litigation, and we'll raise money and we'll fight back against governments that take people's rights away. For example, we did the Emergencies Act challenge. We were successful in federal court on that,
Yes,
on challenging the.
congratulations.
Thank you, thank you. That was an important one. The freezing of the bank accounts, the protest ban, and we also do work like public education through courses. So if you go to our website, you'll find a lot of materials to arm yourself with what you need to know to fight back against some of these encroachments.
So you're part of the good team, I would argue, and you've got a very interesting perch to be able to look at the state of affairs in this country when it comes to individual rights and freedoms. So I'm really delighted that we can have this conversation because I would say that strategically, it seems to me, if you look at both the federal, provincial, municipal level, and all these institutions in between, and well, what else is going on in this country, is stunning in terms of its assault on individual rights and freedoms. It seems like everywhere we turn, there's a lot of bad actors working to undermine our individual rights and freedoms. So, am I being too dramatic or even histrionic on that, Josh? What's your take?
Oh, yeah, certainly not. One thing I will say is a lot of these restrictions that happen, they're not nefarious. They're, people that are poorly educated about rights and freedoms in Canada themselves, and maybe they're volunteering in a local council and they make mistakes and pass bad laws that infringe rights.
Yeah.
But a lot of it really is nefarious. A lot of it is just power grabs by premiers and by, in some cases, all the way up to the prime minister who know that people are scared about something or are worried about something or are happy to lash out at a minority group within society, and so they're willing to jeopardize Canadians' rights, whether it's free expression or their liberty or their equality rights. And so there's a lot going on, and it's coming sort of fast and furiously at us, and we're always trying to fight back.
Well, it sure is like a waterfall. And, it makes me wonder, as you've alluded to, about why this is happening. Does it boil to, well, power, money, ideology? Is that kind of the heart of this? What's driving this?
Yeah, I think it's all of those things, David. In terms of what's happened in recent years, I think the main thing that happened is that COVID-19 happened, and there was a lot of worry, a lot of fear, understandably, from a lot of people. And politicians took advantage of that, like they tend to throughout history whenever there is some emergency. And so, they suspended our rights in all kinds of ways, whether it was lockdowns that were unnecessary or went too far, whether it was vaccine mandates against the truckers after, they'd already been going across the border and back for 2 years, or the Emergencies Act, which I mentioned earlier. And What we're seeing now in 2025 is a lot of people are worried about tariffs or they're worried about the relationship with the United States. And so we're seeing it again. We're seeing premiers and even the prime minister using that as an opportunity to take away people's rights and to not follow the laws and the rule of law.
So, Josh, I don't know about you, but I seem to get the impression that there seems to be, what is it again? Oh, yeah, a crisis happening every week, and then a new piece of legislation designed to respond to the crisis and say, it's almost like kabuki theater. I think of the Japanese tradition, and no offense to that, but this strange world of theater where the politicians, and I don't mean to generalize, but constantly want to use emotion as a way that they can ratchet down on more power and control. And is that a pattern that you see as well?
I think so. I'll give you just one example from the last few months. So, everybody knew in January, February that Donald Trump was planning tariffs on Canada and that this would be very bad for a lot of workers. A lot of people potentially could lose their job. You had a premier out in British Columbia, David Eby, saying that essentially this is war, that we're in a war with the United States. And
I believe the phrase was elbows up.
elbows up, yeah, but I mean, going even further than that in British Columbia, apparently. And Mr. Eby used that as an opportunity to try and pass a law that would have taken away all kinds of power from the legislature, from the all the MLAs that were elected last fall in the election, and give it to himself. He had this clause in this bill called Bill 7 that would have allowed him, as long as you could say this was about strengthening the economy or fighting back against the U.S. threat, to essentially ignore laws that had been passed by the legislature. So, they amp this up. Politicians, whether it's elbows up or saying that this trade war is like a real war, as if they're even remotely comparable. And then you get the people on social media that are ramping that up even further. The mainstream media, I don't think, is not guilty of this themselves. They often will play off that. You've dealt a lot in the media as well, and it all coalesces to make people afraid and allow governments to suspend people's rights.
Yeah, well, it's very concerning. So we're going to talk about it today. We're going to have a little bit of a tour here, doing some of the highlights, and I think it will be a real eye opener. And just before we dive into that, I guess just for the record, when we say individual rights and freedoms, right off the top, our tradition, it's a grand tradition that goes back almost 1,000 years or more, arguably, is this tradition that emphasizes a respect for individuals. So how do you answer the question, what really are the core individual rights and freedoms in this country?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, what we start with is freedom of religion is probably the first major freedom. It's the first one listed in the charter. You have the reasonable limits clause, and then section 2A of the charter is freedom of religion. And that's because historically, those were the first groups to be attacked. People that just wanted to be left alone and practice a different religion from the mainstream. Historically, they couldn't do that in Europe. And so we developed this right for individuals to form groups with others and pray to the God that they wanted to pray to, as opposed to the one that's required. And then, of course, you have freedom of expression, freedom of speech. If you can't criticize the government, if you can't criticize the premier or the prime minister or your local politicians, then you can't affect change. You can't say that they're wrong about things. And, they've been wrong about so many things in the past. As we know, COVID-19 pandemic, there were all kinds of examples we could talk about. And then, of course, you have your freedom of assembly, so your right to gather with other people for a common purpose and peacefully, emphasis here on peacefully, protest or even just, gather in a private space and talk about political issues or religious issues or socialize. And then, of course, there's freedom of association. So this idea that you can gather together in groups and oppose the government through something like a political party or union. And the list goes on and on. Those are the fundamental freedoms, but there are so many more. Whether it's your liberty, your bodily autonomy, your equality rights, your mobility rights, your ability to go where you please without interference from the government. So that's what we're talking about with individual rights.
Well, it's a great summary, Josh, and you can see on reflection why those rights are so important. And I would argue not only for the pursuit of truth, because truth matters, facts matter, it allows us to be a prosperous society. If you can't innovate, if you can't debate things, you can't find truth and you can't be a prosperous society. And that, I think, distinguishes us from so many other societies that have never really gone forward. And I would say, from a moral perspective, it also defines what it means to be human. Like, if you can't respect somebody else's right to govern their own life, then I think that's a problem. And I think one of the things that I'm observing, and I'm curious what you think about this, is the emergence of that so called distinguished class of, well, the good and the great who really think it's their prerogative to kind of rule how you're going to go about your life. Am I looking at this a little bit too cynically, Josh?
No, not at all. I think, David, I think you're really onto something. I think that there are always going to be groups of people in society who see themselves as elite and they think they
Hmm.
know what's better for everybody else. And
Yeah.
so,
They're better than us, Josh.
yeah, or they certainly think they are, right? And often these people are well-meaning. They think, well, I just know, what the one truth here is, right? But
Hmm.
that's for the individual to decide. That's not for any elite group of people to decide for others. And that's why it's so important to have freedom of expression. Just to come up with one random example, this Online Harms Act. I don't know if we'll talk about
Hmm.
this more later,
We
but
will.
this idea that there could be a small group of government appointees who could decide what is hateful and what is hurtful online and what people should and shouldn't be allowed to say to each other when they're debating things on X or when they're in the comments section of YouTube. There are
Hmm.
just so many examples throughout history where that received wisdom, either the church or the state has been wrong about
Hmm.
some important aspect of policy or what it means to be human. Um, you know, Galileo is one example, right? He's imprisoned for saying that the Earth revolves around the sun, and I think we would probably all agree now that he was right about that, right? So that's why these individual freedoms, freedom of religion, expression, liberty, all matter.
No, I totally agree. And we got to teach the kids, the next generation, this stuff because I tell you, it is really bizarre. I just wish people would realize the earth is flat, Josh. But
Yes.
putting that aside, yeah, we need healthy debate and discussion. And I've always said if we don't have that, we're not thinking and nor are we free. And that's my quote of the day. So, speaking of which, let's get to the big list here we're going to go through. And there's a lot of items to go through here. So, one is at the federal level, we've got a lot of bills happening. And one of them is called Bill C2. They do all their numbering. And this is called the Strong Border Act. And of course, we need strong borders. And of course, our friend and trading partner, the U.S., has frankly put a lot of scrutiny on how secure our borders are, rightly or wrongly. But in this case, this act seems like it enables the federal government to not only, quote, strengthen the borders, but it seems to have a lot of other things stuffed in it, including the power to spy on citizens from A to Z in terms of who your internet provider is, like everything. What's your take on this bill, C2?
Yeah, well, like you said, David, there's lots that can be done on borders, security, and there are good things in this bill. Just to give one
Hmm.
example, it makes it much more difficult for international students who have been here for a year to suddenly claim asylum and try to stay in Canada. I think most Canadians would agree with that, but there are several things in this bill that are not all that not all that related even to border security. Funny how that works. That they've snuck into this bill that do raise some privacy and civil liberties concerns. So, first of all, they're going to give Canada Post the power to open your mail, your letter mail, and
Open our mail.
yes. So yeah. So right now, border customs officials, pardon me, Canada Post officials can open your packages to see if you've got drugs in there, if they suspect that this might be drugs. Well, now they'll be able to open your envelopes, your little letters. And this is also to look for drugs, but there's no safeguard built into the law for the privacy aspect of it in terms of what's in your letter. So they could open up and read your letter. And
So
then
no
you'll have,
warrants?
with no warrant, nope, no warrant required. So that's concerning, and there should be some safeguards there. A second aspect is the cash ban. So right now, you can do what you want with cash. If you do certain transactions over 10,000 electronically, that might be monitored for money laundering or for tax purposes. Now, they're going to just say it's illegal to buy anything with $10,000 of cash. Or, for example, if you wanted to support the trucker protest back in 2022 in Ottawa, to hand over $10,000 cash to the organizers of that would be illegal. And, I understand they're trying to get at money laundering or people that are tax cheats, but there's so much privacy involved in what you do with your cash transactions. And the fact that that's now going to be the business of the government and the banks is concerning to a lot of people. One
No
aspect of this
kidding.
bill,
Can I just ask
sure.
about that, Josh? What
Yeah,
is
yeah.
it that these governments, including Klaus Schwab, have with cash? What is their problem? Why do they want to get their fingers on cash?
Well, I can't speak for the WEF or Klaus Schwab, but it seems to be about control at the end of the day. Like if you look at China, for example, if you want to buy anything in China, it's essentially a cashless society. They're at the point where a lot of places you have to scan your iris if you want to buy something at a shop. So the
Wow.
problem, it might not be, some big organized conspiracy to control us, but once you do take away the ability to use cash, it becomes a lot easier to monitor people, to know where they're going, what they're spending their money on, who they're involved with. And so it is the type of thing we need to think a lot about before we let it happen.
But surely, aren't we being a bit paranoid, Josh? I mean, just because the government wants to know where we spend all our money doesn't mean they'll use it for bad purposes. Like they would never freeze our bank accounts, would they, Josh?
Oh no, I'm sure they would never accuse peaceful protesters of being terrorists and freeze their bank accounts. That's
I
not the
mean,
type
I
of thing
mean,
that
I
happens
asked
in
that question
Canada.
provocatively because you were at ground zero with, other groups and people. You were in the front row seat seeing how they invoked the Emergencies Act. If they've done it once, and they've certainly done it other times, they'll do it again. I mean, that's the whole
Yeah.
point. They put in these tools, and they may or may not use them right now, but they will use them sooner or later.
Yeah, and this is often the concern with privacy, David, is people governments will collect information and people will say, well, I'm not worried about giving my information up. I give it up all the time to all these private companies, but the problem is you don't know what they're going to use it for in the future once they've got it.
Hmm.
So they may say, I'm collecting this information today for this purpose, which most Canadians agree with. But once they've got it, right? And so you could have a nefarious government come in that either overreacts or that does want to hurt people and lock up their political opponents. And if you've given up that information, that's a whole lot easier than it would have been
Well,
otherwise, right? So
okay,
we have
but
to be
so
careful.
if we just step back for a sec, though, Josh, isn't this the kind of fork in the road that we're alluding to? This bill, C2, is kind of a marker of different visions of a society. One where you have our normal tradition of due process that goes back 1,000 years, where you have warrants, you have privacy, you have a respect for what you're doing. You could even walk around with cash, versus ultimately a society where you don't need warrants, you don't have due process, and you have a kind of an assumption of limited government, right? This is what our tradition is
Yeah.
hinging on. And I think that's where, is that where you're saying C2 is problematic? It has maybe some good things in it, but it's
Yeah.
overshadowed by these other things that, golly, it's down a wrong path here.
Yeah, it is. And, just to mention a couple other things that are in the bill in case your viewers are not aware, the bill would allow RCMP or other government employees to demand information about you from banks, and all they would need to do is say they're trying to enforce the terrorist and money laundering bill, or act rather, and they don't have to tell you. The bank doesn't have to tell you that they're collecting this information on you. They can do it in secret without a warrant. And if you think back to the truckers' protest, they were labeled by the government terrorists, right? So you might think, oh, well, I'm not a terrorist. I don't need to worry about this. But the governments can label whoever they like to be a terrorist or a member of a terrorist group. So that's the type of thing where we need to worry when they don't get a warrant, because what a warrant does is it's a third party that's disinterested. Wow. It's not the police. It's not the government going after your information. It's a judge that's saying, is this really justified? Do we really need to search this person's bank account? Wow. And so that's why people should be concerned.
Absolutely. And on top of that, the government, through this legislation, can strong arm all kinds of parties that you think you can trust, like your banker, like even your internet provider, supposedly. They can put pressure on them to do snooping around your business, and you don't even know it. That's really quite wrong, isn't it?
Even your doctor, David. So this is another part of the bill we haven't even got to yet. Like I said, it's a bit of a monster. They can demand subscriber information from anyone who operates a website. So you, me, your doctor, any business, not just the big internet companies. And they can't get a lot of information, but what they could get without a warrant is, do they provide services to you, and what municipality do they provide those services to you in? And, if I'm going to a particular type of doctor, let's say it's a psychologist or something, I might not want the government to know that, right? So it's the type of thing where there might be, there's lots of reasons why RCMP or why the government would need to get information about people, but they need to get a warrant first. They have to have that reasonable suspicion at the very least. They shouldn't be able to just go to, any doctor or any internet provider and say, I'm snooping around and I want to know something about this person. That's just not what you do in a free society.
Well, okay, so this bill has not been passed yet. Is that correct?
No, it has not. No.
So if you care, make sure you note this and act accordingly. Bill C5 is the next one, and I want to introduce this one through a clip because it's about building our economy.
Today is a very important day for Canada. Bill C5, our government's One Canadian Economy legislation, has just passed the House of Commons.
The Prime Minister gets his first legislative win as Bill C5 passes the House of Commons. However, the One Canadian Economy Act did hit a speed bump on third reading. The NDP's Jenny Kwan successfully moved to split the bill in two.
In a ruling by Speaker Regan on March 1st, 2018, he said the following: "The principle of principles contained in a bill must not be confused with the field it concerns. To frame the concept of principle in that way would prevent the divisions of most bills."
The NDP and Bloc Québécois say the bill joins two ideas they say seem unrelated. The first part of C5 removes interprovincial trade barriers under federal control.
Yeas pour 335, 335. Nays contre 1-1.
I declare Part 1 of the short title carried.
But the second half covers Mark Carney's push to speed major projects of national significance. The Speaker agreed, ruling the two parts must be voted on separately. The second half says Cabinet may pick what projects get fast-tracked to go around things like the Impact Assessment Act. Conservatives object to the idea of Cabinet picking and choosing projects, and also say it'd be easier to just revoke the act rather than go around it.
Instead of real reform, we get a selective shortcut. All the red tape and bills like C-69 and C-48 remain in place, and there's no clear criteria for what makes a project eligible.
But Tories voted for it just the same. The second half of C5 passed with their support. In response to opposition criticism of the way his party has pushed the bill through quickly, Carney says this was unique, meant to address the current economic crisis, and says he doesn't intend to pass any future bills that allow cabinet to circumvent existing laws.
This is, no, short answer. I mean, this is unique balancing for what exactly the bill is seeking to achieve.
The House is now adjourned for the summer, but the Senate remains sitting and is expected to OK C5 for royal assent next week. In Ottawa, Shaoli Lee, City News.
So there you go. It's an interesting overview of a complex bill, C5. It basically has two parts, as the report says. We need free trade in this country. We need to also, secondly, get things done and built, like pipelines as an example. So, it's very interesting. What is your take on this bill, Josh?
Yeah, so I think like most people, the first part is non-controversial, getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers. Few people have a problem with that. Not an issue from a constitutional perspective. But the second part of this bill, I had a lot of serious concerns about this so-called Building Canada Act, because what has been done here is, instead of getting rid of the Impact Assessment Act or the other laws that were brought in by the previous Liberal government that have really plugged up major projects and slowed down development in Canada, rather than getting rid of those acts, what Carney decided to do was give himself and his cabinet the power to pick and choose a few projects behind closed doors, and we can probably guess that these will be projects that are politically advantageous to them, and exempt those from all kinds of laws. Originally, it was going to exempt them from any federal law, so everything from the Criminal Code to the Official Languages Act to the Bill of Rights, just exempt these projects picked by cabinet behind closed doors from all those laws. And there were some amendments made at the end that said, these projects will still have to comply with things like access to information or conflicts of interest. But at the end of the day, what they're doing is taking Parliament's power away and putting it in the hands of a tiny group of people inside Prime Minister Carney's cabinet. And that is very corrosive for the rule of law, even though we probably all agree that we need to build projects faster.
So it strikes me that Bill C5 then is really about putting even more power into the Prime Minister, the executive, if you will, in terms of the cabinet and the Prime Minister. So this all seems to be on the assumption again that our country should be putting even more power in the hands of politicians in the state rather than empowering the people. Am I looking at this too simplistically, Josh?
No, I think you're right. This is one of the things that, I know I'm a bit of a nerd, but it kind of does keep me up at night, is worrying about Parliament becoming more and more sidelined, because Parliament is the representatives of the people. What we elected back in April was a minority government. We didn't give the Liberal Party a majority power in Parliament. They're supposed to have the support of other MPs before they pass any laws. And what they're going to be able to do here is just essentially go around that and do what they choose. And, this year, I just looked this up earlier today, there are only 73 days where Parliament's going to be sitting this year. So, we have Parliament for a reason. We have it so that they can represent us, so that they can ask questions. They can test out these bills like Bill C2 and say, are there civil liberties concerns here? Are we getting this right? There are multiple readings of a bill before it becomes law. And there's ultimately that vote, and it should be a majority vote before you change the law. But with Bill C5, we're going to be making huge decisions as a country without that vote and behind closed doors in the cabinet room. So
the last time I checked, when the Magna Carta was signed on June 15, 1215, with that horrible King John, one of the requirements of that signing was that the House of Commons, the king had to go to the House of Commons to get anything approved in terms of spending. So now we got here, the House of Commons is not in business, and we don't even have a budget. These are all these things combined, Josh, to me says that the rule of law is being undermined fundamentally because you don't even have any control on the purse strings. We've got a world of rolling budgets, and we don't even have a written budget that we can really reference to. Am I
Yeah,
missing something, Josh?
you're not missing anything at all. It's outrageous that the Liberals said they might not do a budget at all this year, and they are going to do a budget now, supposedly, but not until October. I mean, this is a basic principle that I think most people learn about when they're in high school or hopefully earlier, that there's no taxation without representation. And
That's
if
it.
they're not voting on money bills, if they're just giving, endless supply, then we've lost sort of the basic rule of law, the basics of responsible government in Canada. And I don't think people realize how difficult it might be to get that back if we keep letting governments get away with this, and
Exactly.
they certainly will try.
I mean, I'm paraphrasing Lord Acton, but power corrupts and unlimited power corrupts, in an unlimited way. And you've got a situation where who wouldn't want a blank check? And basically, bills under the so-called emergency crisis time gives you unlimited power practically. I mean, this is really a unique time. So I think people got to wake up and see this. And now, if that isn't enough, Josh, is it true that a nasty piece of legislation looks like it's going to come back again from the Trudeau administration called the Online Harms Act, where they're looking at, well, again, editing, and you've alluded to this earlier, looking at editing and censoring things that they don't want us to get involved in, Josh?
Yeah, so the Online Harms Act just won't die. For those who haven't been paying attention, back in 2021, they introduced this pretty shocking piece of legislation, which would do a number of things, including making social media companies financially responsible if there was so-called harmful content on their websites, and not just content that we would all agree is harmful, like, child exploitation images or so-called revenge pornography, but also just things like so-called hate speech or discriminatory speech. And they even proposed to bring back the old regulator, which was, the old tribunal where people could go and complain that somebody said something offensive to them online, and then they could get money, and also that person who said the bad thing could be fined by the government. We thought this was just sort of, a ploy to get a few votes in the 2021 election, and then they brought it back, and they tried to push this forward until last year, when they finally relented and said, well, we'll split it into different parts, with some of the less offensive parts in a first bill, and they never got it passed. But during the election, Prime Minister Carney, who was then, leader of the party running for prime minister, alluded to all these social media giants spreading so-called xenophobia or hate, and saying he is going to come back and crack down on this type of speech, right? So it's very concerning, and we do expect some form of this to come back in the fall, and just not sure what it will look like. But I sure hope that we're not going to create a special tribunal where people can go and try and wring money out of their fellow citizens for so-called offensive speech.
Yeah. Well, so stay tuned on that one. We'll see what the next iteration of the so-called Online Harms Act looks like. Hopefully it doesn't reemerge, but it looks like there is every indication that will. But that concerns me that this kind of legislation reflects a complete disregard for the importance of freedom of speech, and that, again, the truth matters. You can't have civilization if you don't have that kind of healthy debate. And I think that this is kind of an assault on facts and, frankly, dissent. If you disagree with kind of their orthodoxy of thinking, that somehow the moon is made out of cheese, then or anything that frankly is divorced from reality, you still have to go along with their ideology. It's almost like we're leaving the land of reason and going into the land of unreason. Is that how you see this?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there's always this human urge for sort of witch hunts and to take the person who is saying the controversial thing or the thing that is maybe unpopular that day, and bring them before sort of an inquisition and condemn them. But the best way to fight back against speech that you disagree with or don't like is to just use your own speech, use your own reason, offer up your own arguments. And there's so many debates right now that are more contentious that they need to be, whether it's the Israel-Palestine debate, whether it's the gender debate, and people who identify as transgender in certain sports. And we need to be able to have those conversations so that we can accommodate everybody as best as possible. And you can't do that if people can't speak or are afraid to speak. And when you start bringing in laws where you have a digital safety commissioner who can regulate speech, and you have a tribunal that can fine you for your speech, people clam up, they get quiet, and then we can't have those conversations that we really do need to have as a society.
I think you're absolutely right. And your insight that people clam up, I think, is so important. They self-censor because they're afraid of getting into trouble. I think most Canadians are pretty caring people, and they care enough to hear somebody's point of view. They want to know what you're thinking. But this is the government putting its fingers in things again, driven by government power or special interest groups who say, how dare you, to paraphrase Greta Thunberg, how dare you think in a certain way? How dare you talk in a certain way? I mean, I think that's, well, I'll be frank, I think that's offensive. And it disables our ability to move forward as a civilization. Am I being too dramatic here?
No, I mean, if you look at the civilizations that have freedom of expression, that have free speech, they're the ones that progress the most. They're the ones that, whether you're talking about economically, being able to put your ideas out there and find other people who can help move those ideas forward, or just in social progress and people living as freely as possible. Lots of just to take an example, freedom of speech is what freed Black Americans from Jim Crow laws. It's the thing that led to gender equality, is the ability for women to speak out and say we want different treatment in society, right?
Exactly.
So you need to be able to talk about these things. You need to be able to ruffle feathers, and the government needs to stay out of these things.
Right on. I like how you're thinking, Josh. So speaking of another interesting development, and you alluded to this before, is Bill 7 in British Columbia, of all things, where Premier David Eby introduced sweeping powers, and I would say overreach. So here's a clip.
The BC government has tabled a tariff response bill that would give it sweeping powers to respond to U.S. tariffs without the legislature.
We see this as emergency legislation. This is not everyday legislation.
If passed, the bill would allow the government to remove or amend barriers to interprovincial trade, direct public sector bodies to avoid U.S. suppliers for goods and services, impose a toll on non-Canadian commercial vehicles using provincial public infrastructure, and temporarily modify BC laws and regulations. Eby giving this hypothetical scenario as an example of why the government needs such broad powers.
The United States rips up the Columbia River Treaty. And shuts off access to the common entitlement of electricity between Washington State and Canada. We will have to take some pretty dramatic actions in a very short period of time.
In a social media post, Conservative leader John Rustad called the bill radical, saying, if you thought government overreach during COVID-19 was bad, wait until you hear about what BC's NDP is trying with Bill 7. It gives BC's already authoritarian top-down NDP government sweeping, almost unlimited powers with zero oversight. Eby rejected suggestions the bill is a power grab.
When there's an emergency like a natural disaster, we have these authorities. This is a human-caused disaster. We can see it coming. We don't know what it is, and we need to be able to respond quickly.
The government also stressing there are safeguards in place.
It's not broad in the sense of anything. It has to be something that shows it's an emergency action based on the tariff and the trade war we're in right now.
In response to U.S. tariffs, the BC government has already removed American alcohol from BC liquor store shelves and halted orders of the products. And as of this week, Tesla products, such as chargers and batteries, are no longer eligible for rebates.
I think that if British Columbians heard that $10,000 of taxpayer money was going to Elon Musk, they'd want to throw up.
The proposed legislation, including the emergency powers, would automatically expire in 2027. In Vancouver, Monica Gould, City News.
So is Bill 7 again part of this pattern where we get rid of the legislative role and we introduce again more executive power with the premier and the cabinet to do whatever they want to do? Am I looking at this too simplistically, Josh?
No, that's really it. Premier Eby knew that if he tried to put forward a bill where he grabs all this power for himself, where he says, I want to give myself the ability to ignore any law passed by the legislature, and he can sell this to people and make them afraid enough of the U.S. tariff situation, then he could probably get away with it. But thankfully, in this case, he did not get away with it. The Canadian Constitution Foundation and many others pushed back. And so that particular clause that allows him to ignore most laws as long as he has this pretext of fighting back against tariffs, that's no longer in the bill that actually became law. So it's a bit of a good news story in that people do still notice these things. They still do notice these power grabs, and sometimes they're successfully able to push back.
Okay, so that's a great news story that right there, Josh, your group and others successfully push back. So we can get things modified. We don't just have to throw up our hands, to use the metaphor of body here, elbows up. We can actually make a difference here, Josh. So that's a great story. On the other side of the country, we've got the province of Prince Edward Island, a fascinating case with a municipal councillor named, I believe it's in Murray Harbor. His name is Councillor John Robertson. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Yeah, so John Robertson is just one of many, many councillors across the country who's faced restrictions on his free speech from what are called codes of conduct. And these are, policies or bylaws that a lot of municipalities have in place. And what they do is they will say, you can't harass people, or you can't, you can't do things that lack integrity. And then they'll take these words like harassment or integrity and say, if you say anything we don't agree with or we don't like, you're going to have a code of conduct complaint.
So in other words, the code of conduct isn't about things like, well, you've got to, for example, wear pants in a meeting, or you've got to, not use foul language. No, they're putting in an ideological position, arguably.
Well, I don't know
right?
that this is the thing that, like, the way that they're written is not necessarily going to be read that way, but the way that they're used in practice is to just go after the speech of councillors that they don't like. So you'll have, a council of 4 or 5 people, and they'll vote to censure or punish in some other way a fellow councillor for his or her speech. And that's what happened to John Robertson. He has an old sign on his property where you can change the letters. It's one of those signs with plastic letters that you see outside of churches or municipal buildings. And he puts all kinds of messages on there, Happy Canada Day or congratulations on your wedding. He put a very controversial message on in October 2023 where he said, truth, mass grave hoax, reconciliation, redeem Sir John A.'s integrity. And this was a reference in his view to what he sees as a media perpetrated hoax related to the supposed discovery of bodies of children. We're all familiar with the story outside of Kamloops residential school. And so it's controversial speech. There's no doubt about that, but it was his own private speech on his own private property, and his fellow municipal councillors decided that this speech needed to be shut down. And so they They fined him. They demanded an apology. They took him off committees. They tried to get the premier to take him off council, all for his private speech on his private property that had nothing to do with his council duties. So it's just yet another example of municipalities being little petty tyrants, frankly, when it comes to trying to control
Isn't that interesting?
free speech of other people. Yeah.
But very concerning because, again, we need, healthy debate. And so they're using a kind of a clever mechanism, a code of conduct to enforce a particular way of going after their political opponents. So is that a kind of another form of lawfare, using the law as a mechanism to vilify and, in fact, in the extreme, criminalize and put in jail your political opponent?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly reasonable to call this lawfare. You see these policies come out, and some of them, for example, in Calgary, they have one that says counselors have to take anti-racism training, and it's quite biased training. And then they say, if you don't follow this so-called anti-racism policy in your political debates, then we'll go after you. So there's all kinds of people out there who want to censor other people's speech, and they'll find tools to do it, right?
Gosh, it sounds like we're so tolerant that we're intolerant of people that think differently than us.
It's one way of putting it.
Wow. So there's another interesting case that's come up here, and I think it goes to another very important part of our judicial system is the police, the ability to do independent investigation based on rules of evidence, not hearsay or truncated process. And I'm curious about the case of the RCMP, because I think we could give many examples where many of us would question whether the RCMP, a very important policing force in our country, has been compromised, in the sense that, I'll give you an example. There are literally over 100 churches that have been burned down in this country after the so-called fine of mass graves in Kamloops. And, there's been violence perpetrated against all kinds of resource-based projects. I think of the attack on camps with the Coastal Gas Pipeline project. To my knowledge, there's never been any charges or persons brought to justice in these cases. Now, I could be corrected, but does this not raise flags that there's a different standard of justice for different people based on their political actions? Am I being too cynical here, Josh? And does this
I
raise
think
concerns?
it's really concerning. I mean, if going back to the Magna Carta, the whole basic idea of the Magna Carta is that we should be ruled by laws instead of ruled by people. And
That's it.
closely related to that is this idea that everybody should be equal under the law, and everybody's rights matter, and every individual is equal with another individual. And when police seem to be taking one political side over the other, or when they start prioritizing one group's claims over another group's claims, I think that we're losing that rule of law. And another example, just to throw out there, David, is looking at the protests during the Freedom Convoy versus protests now against Israel. And a lot of the people involved in the Freedom Convoy were charged. Many of them, I would say, did commit mischief, and they were charged, and some of them are facing serious consequences for that. Some of them have already faced jail time and might face more. But if you're protesting against Israel week after week, blocking streets, there doesn't seem to be any consequence for that. So whatever the law is, whether you agree with the law or not, police need to be enforcing it equally for everybody. And it's really disturbing. The churches, especially, just how little we seem to know about who burned them down and how far those investigations went and how seriously that was taken. Because I'm pretty sure if it was a mosque or something burnt down, at least here in Toronto, police would put a lot of resources into finding out what happened and arresting the people as they should, right? So,
Well, I think
yeah.
you make very good points, Josh, and it's very concerning because in order for our society to work, we need a sense of the fair application of law by everybody, whether it's the courts, whether it's the police, everybody as a team. And when that perception is compromised, I think then you really undermine the trust that justice is being done and the perception that justice is being done. Is that a concern?
That's such a huge concern, David. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We're getting to a place where a lot of people don't trust the law anymore, and what happens when you're not ruled by law is you start to be ruled by strong men or strong women, and then what happens is we end up in a chaotic, violent society where you can't predict whether police are going to enforce your rights, and that makes it difficult to start a business, raise a family, do all the things you might want to do as a free person. So we need the rule of law in order to maintain our freedom and our prosperity.
I totally agree. It's interesting, Josh. Part of your background is that you're not only a lawyer with extensive training and as counsel to the foundation, but you also have a journalistic background, both at Maclean's and CTV and with the National Post. And I find it interesting the role of the media when it comes to the rule of law. And I think they have a very important role, I'm sure you'd agree, in terms of information, their emphasis on facts and information, speaking truth to power, quite frankly. This case that just came out this past week regarding a former CBC anchor, and pardon my pronunciation, I think his name is Travis Derange, is a fascinating one. And he says he was forced out for raising concerns about tokenism, if I understand his concerns correctly, and concerns that his own take on stories didn't fit with the CBC narrative that perhaps tilted in other directions. And I don't know all the specifics, so I want to be careful how I speak about it. But were his accusations a surprise to you in terms of his concerns?
No, you know what? Sadly, David, they're not. If you've worked inside Canadian media, you know that most mainstream media has a particular viewpoint. They'll pretend that they are non-biased and that they treat everybody equally, but they tend to have their political leanings, and it's generally a center-left, pro-Liberal Party of Canada sort of bias. And what you see is, within a story, you'll often have both sides, but where it really comes into play is in the story selection. So just to give you a couple examples from my days at CTV, there was a huge issue with people crossing the border into Canada at Roxham Road. I think your listeners will remember that, people coming across.
Just south of Montreal there?
That's right. So in Quebec, claiming asylum. And that was a story that, a lot of people had different feelings about, but it was a story where at CTV, you weren't even allowed to say that these crossings were illegal. This was a policy of saying, essentially taking sides on whether or not that act was appropriate or not. And yeah, just another example. You'll recall a time when Jordan Peterson.
Can I just clarify for a sec, though, Josh? Why would it be controversial to call out the Roxham Road crossings where you had literally tens of thousands of illegal aliens walking right through literally a huge gap in the fence there into this country? Why would it be so controversial to call that out as illegal when it is?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of people have a lot of sympathy for people coming from overseas and claiming asylum. And the simple fact of the matter is, crossing that border is illegal. But if you are, if you're a center left person or you have a particular viewpoint where you sympathize a lot more than the typical Canadian with those people, you might want to avoid calling them illegal because it draws too much attention to the issue, and it might cause the government to crack down and close that border crossing, which they
Okay.
eventually did,
Yeah.
right?
So you may be sympathetic to that cause of illegal aliens coming into your country,
Right.
or perhaps kind of out of an ideological concern. And I have spoken with these persons of this opinion, where they see borders as illegitimate. They see these laws as illegitimate, that we are all, quote, citizens of this world, which I believe we're all residents as human beings of this world, but we're not citizens of everybody else's country. We're only citizens of, well, in this case, Canada. And I think that's a very important part of enabling a high functioning society. And I know it's more complicated, but I find it interesting that that perspective then has a significant impact then on how media coverage is done.
Yeah, it certainly does. And that's just to pick one random issue, but different people have different perspectives on this idea of, should we have a very strong border where we take in no refugees and we turn everyone back, or should we have a completely open border? And the problem is that in the mainstream media in Canada, most journalists, because of their background, they tend to be urbanites who all went to the same schools. They all have the same opinion on that. But the reality is Canadians don't, and they want to have that conversation. They want to have that debate, and that's how we should be able to settle things in Canada. But because the media is so monolithic in this country and all seems to share the same viewpoint on these things, at least the broadcast media, then we can't have these debates. And then what you end up with is the situation we have in 2025, where suddenly everyone seems to realize that the immigration system's not working right.
Exactly. Yeah. So then, unfortunately, if the media isn't reporting on those facts with integrity, I would argue, then we can't really have a fulsome public policy discussion about what needs to be done to serve the Canadian people. So in that context as well, I'm wondering, is the media, its role, has it been short-circuited, quite frankly, Josh, by the federal funding of some 2,000 media outlets in this country? And they are required to report on certain issues, whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, or climate change, or what's the third one? Oh, yes, reconciliation. So on those three counts, then, you've kind of done a quid pro quo with the media as the federal government funds some 2,000 outlets. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I mean, I think most journalists realize that when they're funded by the government, that it puts them in a conflict of interest. And what we have in Canada, people tend to know that the newspapers are being funded through the federal government. I don't think they realize as much how much the federal government controls the broadcast media's ability to make money through its regulations. And so the same problems exist there. And of course, the biggest example would be CBC. CBC gets an enormous amount of money from the government. And if you have one party saying, we'll fund you more, and another party saying, we'll cut you, as was the case in the last election, you can imagine that even subconsciously, a journalist who's trying to be fair will have that in the back of their mind. So, we're at a really bad place here in Canada when it comes to just finding out the facts that we would hope media would collect for us in an unbiased way, because these media organizations are no longer unbiased. They really are putting their fingers on the scale of the government side. And so thank goodness for podcasts and people who try to add context to these things like you do, David.
Well, thank you. And touche to you as well, Josh. We've got to get the word out, and we've got to have that healthy debate. And I think one of the fascinating things that I noticed within your myriad of cases that you're working on is also your work within institutions that relate to the sense of the rule of law in this country and what is fair play. And the case of UBC is a fascinating one, because we often assume that universities are places of, what is it again? Oh yeah, truth and knowledge And and I mean that sincerely. There's a lot of very important programs and expectations that we have around universities, and yet, golly, it seems like there's a lot of places within certain faculties, particularly the arts and social sciences and humanities, that is really going sideways. As so many faculty describe themselves as frankly as Marxists, it's hard to believe. But can you tell us about this case at UBC of all things?
So at UBC, we have several professors and a former student who are suing the university because of the politicization of the university. And what we're talking about is the university administration itself. So you're talking about, the president or the Senate, the official bodies of the university, not individual professors who are completely entitled to academic freedom, but the university in British Columbia, UBC, it's required by law to be non-political. It actually states that in Section 66(1) of their University Act, the university shall be non-political. And that exists for a reason. This is a public university funded by the taxpayers of British Columbia, and the administration shouldn't be taking sides on issues like climate change, like the Israel-Gaza conflict, which they've done repeatedly in the past couple of years, or by doing things like saying in their job advertisements that if you want to work at the University of British Columbia, you have to strongly agree with DEI principles. Well, DEI is a political ideology. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but it's a set of political precepts. And we're at a place now where you can't even apply for a job as a professor to study whether this ideology is a good philosophy or a bad philosophy, unless you say, I agree with this philosophy. So that's what we're trying to do in this UBC case.
So,
is push
so
back
you're
against
saying that
that.
if I even want to be on faculty at this university, I got to sign a written statement that says I got to think a certain way in terms of this DEI.
Well, you might not have to sign a particular statement. There are some requirements where you have to talk about what you've done to support DEI, and then there are particular job ads. So we've collected several examples. An engineering job comes up and it says qualifications for this job: you must strongly commit to DEI principles. Well, people are they obviously need to not discriminate, and they need to follow the law, whether it's the Human Rights Code or equality under the Constitution. But this idea that you have to commit to this political ideology is really, really corrosive to academic freedom of professors and students alike.
Wow. So instead of getting the best engineer, I've got to give them my credentials when it comes to not only, study of engineering, but my credentials in terms of ideology, politics, ways of thinking. So that's wrong, isn't it, Josh?
It's wrong for a public university, right? It's a university that's supposed to belong to all British Columbians, and any good university is a place where people can have all kinds of viewpoints and go where their research takes them, right? That's why we have academic freedom, just like freedom of speech. You need people to be able to go out on a limb and say something that other people might think is wrong in their research. And you can't do that if the university is saying, before you step in this door, you have to agree to these particular political principles, right? So it's quite disturbing.
I share your concern. Well, so one of the questions I have as we kind of wrap up this far-reaching conversation, Josh, has to do with the legal profession. Because it seems to me that lawyers, they've always been certainly part of that unique group of people that have been my heroes, because I've always seen them as people that have this unique role in society to uphold the law, to advocate for truth and discussion, to advocate for those traditions of, rights and freedoms. And yet when I'm turning to this country, I see law society after law society being inundated with all kinds of training around the very things that we're talking about, DEI to God knows what else. And I think of the case of Jim Heller and the BC Law Society, and I know they're doing this in other law societies like Alberta, Manitoba, I've heard of. There's others, you would know the picture. And I look at this and I say, the Law Society of BC denies defaming lawyer in dispute over unmarked graves. Again, it goes back to what are the facts and why can't we have discussion? And this is in the context where the society's doing so-called training in terms of these issues, and you have to think a certain way. So help us understand, what is the significance of this case, Josh?
It's really significant. Lawyers, they need to be competent. They need to be able to provide competent legal services to the public. They need to be ethical. They need to know what they're doing. But what's happening now with this training, which is training supposedly to advance reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians, is quite disturbing because, frankly, a lot of the training is saying that very much contested facts are undisputable. For example, once you get into this tragedy at residential schools that we talked about, where there are potential unmarked graves of children, once the Law Society starts saying, well, you have to accept that this happened, even though the evidence is not yet there, that's quite disturbing, right? Lawyers are supposed to defend the truth. They're supposed to defend their clients, fearlessly and zealously, and yet they can't do that when law societies are taking ideological positions and trying to force people to accept as fact things that are very much still in dispute. And so we really need to be concerned, and we need to push back as lawyers. Here in Ontario, lawyers did that several years ago when there was a new requirement to write a so-called statement of principles, where you would attest to certain things related to DEI, and successfully pushed back. So I hope lawyers are able to do the same in British Columbia with what's going on there.
Okay, so again, we can push back. And I guess that reaches the final question of our discussion today, Josh, and that is, what can citizens do here? I mean, we have gone through, frankly, an overwhelming list of challenges to individual rights and freedoms, and I know it's the tip of the iceberg. But what can we do as citizens to, in effect, push back on these types of infringements on individual rights and freedoms?
Well, don't despair, right? Because we've given lots of examples here today, David, both of us, where governments tried to quash rights, or they tried to grab power, and people did successfully push back. Bill 7's worst aspect is gone. It didn't happen. With Bill C5, there were some amendments made as a result of pushback from NDP, Bloc Québécois, Conservatives, and just general nonpartisan members of the public. So there are now certain acts, like the Conflict of Interest Act, that companies specially chosen for these projects won't be able to just ignore. Something like Bill C2, this summer, before Parliament comes back, people can sign petitions, they can call their members of Parliament, they can write op-eds, they can talk to their friends and neighbors about this bill and try and get them involved in pushing back. Democracy is at risk in Canada, there's no doubt, but it's not dead yet. So there's lots you can do. And I'll just say one more thing, just a plug for the CCF and the work we do. We have free courses on our website at theccf.ca/learn, where you can learn about your privacy rights, your constitutional rights. And we'll soon have one for high school students as well. So, educate yourself, listen to podcasts like this one, like yours, David, or like Not Reserving Judgment from the CCF. And that's really the first step. So don't despair. There's lots you can do.
Well, I like your message, Josh. We can't take our individual rights and freedoms for granted, and we can make a difference. And by golly, get involved. And I really appreciated our conversation today. So, Josh Dehaas, the counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, David.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.